I never expected that a plumbing disaster would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. It sounds like the setup for a bad joke, the kind of thing you'd see in a sitcom where the laugh track cues you when to feel something. But my life wasn't a sitcom. It was quiet, it was ordered, and it was, if I'm being honest with myself, profoundly lonely. That is, until a burst pipe, a frantic knock, and the man from apartment 4B turned my world upside down. My name is Lucas. At the time, I was a 28-year-old graphic designer who worked almost exclusively from home. My apartment, 3B, was my sanctuary and my office. It was a space I had curated with meticulous care, from the cool gray of the walls to the precise alignment of books on my shelves. My days fell into a rhythm that was comforting in its predictability. I'd wake up, make coffee, sit at my desk for 8 to 10 hours moving pixels around a screen, make dinner for one, and maybe watch a movie before bed. It was a stable existence, but one lived behind a screen, both literally and figuratively. The building itself had more personality than I did. It was an old textile warehouse converted into loft apartments, all exposed brick, ancient timber beams, and enormous windows that let in the afternoon light. It had its quirks. The elevator was temperamental and the hallways echoed, but it had character. I'd lived there for 3 years and knew my neighbors mostly as familiar faces in the shared spaces. We'd exchange polite nods in the mailroom or hold the door for one another in the lobby. They were part of the scenery of my life, background characters in a story where I was the solitary protagonist. And then there was Julian. He was apartment 4B, directly above me. Julian was not just part of the scenery. He was a feature presentation. He was a carpenter, and he looked the part. He had broad shoulders and strong hands, and he often wore work boots and jeans dusted with fine sawdust that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. I'd see him carrying his heavy tool belt, the worn leather slung low on his hips, and I'd feel a peculiar sort of ache in my chest. He had a friendly, open face, dark hair that was always a little messy, and a smile that he gave out freely to everyone. I, of course, was not everyone. With me, he was perfectly polite, but it was the standard neighborly politeness. Hey man, in the hallway, a nod as he got his mail. For my part, I was a mess of quiet observation and intense, unspoken longing. I had constructed an entire narrative around him in my head. He was confident, capable, and, in my estimation, completely and totally straight. He was the kind of guy who probably spent his weekends playing sports with his buddies and dating girls with bright, easy laughs. He was, in every conceivable way, unattainable. So I kept my distance, treating my crush like a secret exhibit in the museum of my mind. Something to be looked at, but never, ever touched. Still, I noticed things. I noticed the way he always held the door for Mrs. Gable, the elderly woman on the second floor, and would carry her groceries up for her without being asked. I saw him once on the shared rooftop patio, patiently untangling the string of a kite for a little kid who lived on the top floor. He had a gentleness about him, a quiet kindness that seemed to contradict the rugged, overtly masculine image. These small moments were like fuel for my hopeless fire, deepening the crush I was trying so hard to keep under wraps. He was a good person. That, more than anything, was what made my heart clench. The Saturday it all happened started like any other. I was at my desk, trying to finalize a logo design for a client who couldn't seem to decide between forest green and hunter green. The sky outside was a flat, uninspiring gray. I was just about to give up and make lunch when I heard a commotion from upstairs. It wasn't the usual sound of footsteps or a piece of furniture being moved. This was a frantic thudding, a muffled curse, and then, most alarmingly, the sound of rushing water. My focus shattered. I sat up straight, listening. The sound grew louder, a persistent, aggressive hiss that was definitely not normal. Before I could even really process it, there was a frantic, pounding knock on my door. It wasn't a polite tap. It was the kind of knock that signaled an emergency. My heart leaped into my throat. I hurried to the door and pulled it open, my mind racing through a dozen worst-case scenarios. There he was, Julian. He was standing in my doorway looking utterly wrecked. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his t-shirt was soaked through, clinging to his chest. Water dripped from his eyelashes and ran in rivulets down his neck. He looked stunned, stressed, and completely overwhelmed. For a second, I forgot to speak. I just stared, taking in the sight of this monumentally composed man looking utterly lost. "Lucas, man, I am so sorry," he said, his voice strained. He ran a hand through his wet hair, flinging droplets onto my welcome mat. "A pipe? A main pipe in my kitchen just went. It's everywhere. The super is on his way, but he's shutting the water off to my unit for, like, he said it could be days." He gestured vaguely upwards with a thumb, as if pointing to the disaster unfolding in his apartment. I could see the panic in his eyes, the sheer stress of having his home suddenly and violently disrupted. And in that moment, all my carefully constructed walls of shy observation and intimidated distance crumbled. This wasn't the confident, unattainable carpenter from my daydreams. This was just a person, a neighbor, who was having a really bad day. "Oh my God, are you okay?" The words tumbled out of me, pure instinct. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, I mean, I'm not drowning. But my apartment might be. I don't know what I'm going to do. I guess I'll find a hotel or something." He looked defeated, and the thought of him packing a bag and trudging off to some sterile, anonymous hotel room felt incredibly wrong. And then, before my brain could stop me, before my usual caution could kick in and remind me of all the reasons this was a complicated, potentially awkward idea, I heard myself say, "You can stay here." The words hung in the air between us, feeling both impossibly brave and utterly insane. "I have a spare room. It's not much, but it has a bed. You can stay here until they fix everything." Julian froze. He stared at me, his frantic energy coming to a dead halt. I saw a flicker of disbelief in his eyes, followed by a wave of something else. Relief. A profound, bone-deep relief that seemed to make his shoulders slump. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Yeah, of course. It's no problem, really." He closed his eyes for a second, letting out a long breath. When he opened them again, they were filled with a raw gratitude that made my stomach do a slow, nervous flip. "Lucas," he said, and the way he said my name was different than it had ever been before. It was heavier, more meaningful. "Thank you. Seriously. You have no idea what that means right now." And just like that, the barrier between apartment 3B and 4B, between Lucas and Julian, washed away in a flood of goodwill and busted plumbing. He came back down a little while later with a duffel bag and a backpack, looking slightly more composed but still damp around the edges. I showed him to the spare room, which was mostly a storage space for my old art supplies and a bed that was perpetually unmade. I felt a sudden pang of self-consciousness about its cluttered state. "It's a bit of a mess, sorry," I mumbled, clearing a stack of sketchbooks off the nightstand. "Are you kidding me? It's perfect," Julian said, dropping his bag on the floor. He looked around the room, then back at me. "This is incredibly cool of you. I promise I'll be as out of your way as possible. Don't worry about it," I said, trying to sound casual, as if my heart wasn't performing a drum solo in my chest. "Mi casa es su casa," or whatever. I cringed internally at my own awkwardness. That evening was surreal. The routine of my solitary life was completely shattered. Instead of eating my sad dinner for one, I found myself sitting on the living room floor with Julian, sharing a large pepperoni pizza from a box balanced between us. My dining table was a sacred workspace, covered in sketches and reference books for my current project, and the thought of clearing it was more daunting than just camping out on the floor. Julian didn't seem to mind. "So, graphic design, huh?" he asked, grabbing his third slice. "That's cool. What kind of stuff do you do?" It was the first real conversation we'd ever had, and I found myself stumbling over my words, trying to explain the nuances of branding and user interface design to him. I was sure he'd be bored, but he listened intently, asking smart questions. He had a way of looking at you when you spoke that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. It was unnerving and exhilarating all at once. "It's mostly corporate stuff," I admitted, feeling a little lame. "Logos, websites. It pays the bills." "Nothing wrong with that," he said. "You're making things. That's what matters." He told me about carpentry, about the satisfaction of building something tangible with his own hands, of turning a pile of raw lumber into a sturdy cabinet or a perfectly fitted door frame. He spoke about wood with a kind of reverence, describing the unique grain of oak versus the smooth finish of maple. His passion was palpable, and it was magnetic. We talked for hours. The initial awkwardness melted away, replaced by a comfortable, easy rapport. It turned out we had a surprising amount in common. We liked the same obscure indie bands and had a shared love for old horror movies. It felt less like getting to know a stranger and more like catching up with an old friend. I was seeing a side of him I'd never imagined, a person far more complex than the one-dimensional character from my daydreams. A couple of days into his stay, I discovered something else. I came out of my bedroom one afternoon to find him sitting on my sofa, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, a little sheepishly, as if I'd caught him doing something he shouldn't. "Hey," he said. "Just, looking at some stuff. Everything okay?" I asked, moving toward the kitchen to get a glass of water. "Yeah, fine. Just, here, check this out." He seemed hesitant, but he turned his phone screen toward me. I walked over and looked. The screen was filled with images of intricately carved wooden objects. They weren't furniture or practical items. They were sculptures. There was a stunningly detailed feather, each barb so finely carved it looked like you could blow it away. There was a human hand, curled loosely, with every knuckle and tendon rendered with breathtaking realism. There was a swirling, abstract shape that looked like smoke captured in solid form. I was floored. "You made these?" I asked, my voice full of awe. He nodded, a faint blush creeping up his neck. "Yeah, it's just a hobby. Something I do in my spare time. It's different from the day job." "Different?" "Julian, these are incredible," I said, taking the phone from him to scroll through more pictures. "This is fine art. Why didn't you say you were an artist?" He shrugged, looking down at his hands. "I don't know. Carpenter sounds more, practical. I don't really show this stuff to many people." That single admission cracked something open for me. Here was this man who I had perceived as the pinnacle of straightforward, masculine confidence, and he was hiding this delicate, beautiful, vulnerable part of himself. It was a secret talent, a hidden depth that made him infinitely more real and, to my dismay, infinitely more attractive. My carefully managed crush was quickly spiraling into something much deeper, something that felt dangerously close to real affection. I was starting to see the man, not just the fantasy, and the man was even better. The days settled into a new, shared rhythm. I'd work in my office, and he'd read on the couch or quietly watch movies, always respectful of my space. But there were small moments of connection that felt seismic to me. One night, I was working late, pushing against a tight deadline. My eyes were burning, my shoulders were a knot of tension, and I was running on pure caffeine and stress. I was so engrossed that I didn't even hear him get up. Suddenly, a mug appeared in my peripheral vision, placed gently on a coaster next to my keyboard. It was a cup of chamomile tea, steam rising in a fragrant cloud. I looked up to see Julian standing there, a small, quiet smile on his face. He didn't say anything. He just gave a little nod, as if to say, "You look like you need this," and then walked away, leaving me staring at the cup. It was such a small thing, a cup of tea, but in the solitary landscape of my life, it felt like a monumental act of kindness. It was a gesture of quiet care, of someone noticing me, really seeing me, and wanting to make my life a little easier. As I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic, I watched him settle back onto the couch, and a feeling of warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the tea. It was hope, a terrifying, fragile, and utterly wonderful little spark of hope, and I had no idea what to do with it. By the 5th day, I got a text from the building supervisor. The repairs on 4B were complete. The new pipes were in, the floor had been dried out, and everything was back to normal. Julian could go home. When I told him, a strange quiet fell over the apartment. The easy camaraderie we'd built over the last few days was suddenly replaced by a thick, unspoken tension. "Oh," he said. "Great. That's great news." But his voice was flat, and he didn't look at me. He just stared at the TV screen, where a nature documentary was playing on mute. He spent the next hour packing his duffel bag in the spare room. I could hear him moving around in there, the zip of the bag, the rustle of clothes. Each sound felt like a tick of a clock, counting down the seconds until he would walk out my door and back up to his own apartment, back to being just my neighbor. The thought left a hollow pit in my stomach. This temporary, accidental domesticity had felt more like home than my apartment had in years. He emerged from the room with his bag slung over his shoulder. He stood in the middle of my living room, looking just as out of place as he had the day he'd arrived, but for an entirely different reason. He seemed to be lingering, searching for something to say. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged. "Well," I said finally, my voice sounding tight and unnatural. "I guess this is it." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Yeah, guess so," but he didn't move toward the door. He just stood there, his knuckles white where he gripped the strap of his bag. The air crackled with everything we weren't saying. "Thank you for letting me stay. I'll miss this. Don't go." Then he looked up, and his eyes met mine. The expression in them was so intense it made me catch my breath. It was a mixture of frustration, confusion, and something else, something raw and desperate that I couldn't quite name. "Lucas," he started, his voice rough. "Before I go, I need to talk to you." My heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. This was it. This was the moment where he'd thank me politely, maybe offer to buy me dinner as a thank you, and then our strange little interlude would be over. I braced myself for the cordial end, the return to normalcy. "This week," he said, taking a half step closer. "It's been," he trailed off, shaking his head slightly as if he couldn't find the right words. The frustration in his face deepened. He looked like a man at war with himself. He took another step, closing the distance between us until he was standing only a foot away. I could feel the heat radiating from him. I could smell the faint scent of soap and something that was just uniquely him. My mind went blank. I could only stand there, frozen, watching the storm in his eyes. He let out a sharp, frustrated breath, a sound that was almost a growl. And then, all at once, the battle was over. He moved. It was a single, fluid motion. He dropped his bag, and in the same instant, he closed the final gap between us. He backed me up against the nearest wall, his body pressing lightly against mine. My breath hitched. Before I could process what was happening, he reached up, and his hands closed around my wrists. He lifted my arms, pinning them gently but firmly against the wall above my head. My world narrowed to the feeling of his thumbs pressing lightly into the sensitive skin of my inner wrists, the solid wall at my back, and the overwhelming presence of him in front of me. This wasn't aggressive. It wasn't violent. It was desperate. It was the raw, unfiltered expression of some immense feeling that had broken its leash. His face was inches from mine, his eyes dark and searching. And then he kissed me. It wasn't a soft, tentative kiss. It was deep and hard and hungry, a kiss born of 5 days of unspoken tension and months of silent longing. It was questioning and demanding all at once, his lips moving against mine with an intensity that stole the air from my lungs. My mind, which had been racing moments before, went completely silent. There was only the shock, the heat, the overwhelming, undeniable reality of Julian's mouth on mine. After a moment of pure, stunned paralysis, my body responded before my brain could. I leaned into him, kissing him back with all the pent-up hope and fear I'd been holding inside. The kiss lasted for what felt like an eternity and no time at all. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, his breathing ragged. He slowly released my wrists, and my hands fell limply to my sides. He looked as stunned as I felt. His eyes were wide, a mixture of shock and terror, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just done. He whispered, his voice hoarse. He shook his head again, a look of panic washing over his face. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I have to go." And with that, he turned, snatched his bag from the floor, and was out the door before I could say a single word. The lock clicked shut behind him, plunging the apartment into a silence that was 1,000 times louder and more profound than any noise I had ever heard. I stood there, my back pressed against the cool wall, my lips still tingling, my wrists still feeling the ghost of his grip. My entire world had just been reconfigured in the space of 30 seconds, and then the architect of that change had simply vanished, leaving me alone in the deafening quiet. The silence he left behind was a physical presence. It filled the apartment, seeping into the corners and pressing down on me. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, my legs splayed out in front of me. I raised a hand to my lips, the skin still buzzing, still warm from the impossible pressure of his. It had happened. It had actually happened. But what had happened? My mind, finally kicking back into gear, began to spin, replaying the scene on an endless, torturous loop. The look in his eyes, the desperate frustration, the way he'd pinned my wrists, the kiss. God, the kiss. It had been more real than anything I had felt in years. And then, the aftermath. The apology. The panic in his eyes. The hasty retreat. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." Those 5 words echoed in my head, a cruel counterpoint to the memory of the kiss itself. Had he regretted it instantly? Was it just a moment of madness, a temporary confusion brought on by the strange intimacy of our week together? Maybe he was just grateful, and his emotions got tangled up and came out wrong. The thought was a cold spike of dread in my gut. Maybe I had imagined the feeling behind it, projecting my own desperate hope onto what was, for him, a simple mistake. I spent the rest of the day in a fog of anxious analysis. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back at the wall, feeling his hands on my wrists, his mouth on mine. My body remembered it as a beginning, a breathtaking confirmation. But my brain, my cautious, overthinking brain, was screaming that it was an end. A messy, confusing, and painful end. I dissected every moment of our week together. The shared pizza, the conversation about his art, the cup of tea. Had I misread all of it? Had I constructed a fantasy out of a series of small kindnesses? That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. I could hear the faint, familiar sounds of someone moving around in the apartment above me. Julian. He was back in his own space, separated from me by 10 inches of plaster and wood, but he might as well have been on another planet. Was he lying awake, too? Was he thinking about it? Or had he already dismissed it, chalked it up to a weird week and moved on? The not knowing was a unique form of torture. The next day was a Sunday. I stayed inside my apartment like a hermit. The idea of running into him in the hallway or the laundry room was unbearable. What would I say? How would I act? Could I pretend that the most significant event of my recent life hadn't happened? I felt like a raw nerve, and the entire building felt like a minefield. Every creak from the floorboards above sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I tried to work, but the design on my screen was just a meaningless blur. My focus was gone, completely consumed by the echo of that kiss and the crushing weight of his apology. Hope is a dangerous thing. It had crept into my quiet life so subtly, and now its potential absence felt like a gaping wound. I had allowed myself, for just a few days, to imagine a different kind of life. A life with shared meals and quiet company, with easy laughter and cups of tea made by someone else. A life with Julian. And now, it felt like I had been a fool for even daring to imagine it. The risk of rejection felt so much worse now that I had tasted, for just a moment, what it might be like not to be rejected. By Monday afternoon, I had worked myself into a state of resigned misery. It was a mistake. I had to accept it. I had to find a way to be his neighbor again, to exchange polite nods in the mailroom and pretend my heart didn't break a little every time I saw him. I would have to be an adult about it. I would have to bury the memory of that kiss so deep inside myself that it couldn't hurt me anymore. I was standing in my kitchen, staring blankly into my refrigerator and trying to build up the resolve to do just that, when there was a knock on the door. It was a soft, hesitant knock, not the frantic pounding of the week before. My blood ran cold. I knew, with absolute certainty, who it was. My first instinct was to hide, to pretend I wasn't home. But I couldn't. This limbo was unbearable. I needed to know, one way or the other. Taking a deep, shaky breath, I walked to the door and opened it. It was Julian. He stood there looking nervous and exhausted, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jeans. He wasn't looking at me, but at his own feet, as if he was studying the pattern of my doormat. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. He finally dragged his eyes up to meet mine. He looked like he hadn't slept either. Can I come in for a second?" My voice was stuck in my throat. I just nodded and stepped aside, holding the door open for him. He walked past me into the living room, stopping in the exact spot where he had dropped his bag 2 days earlier. He turned to face me, and the silence stretched out again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't empty. It was full of a nervous, fragile energy. "Look," he started, running a hand over the back of his neck. "The other day when I left, the way I left, that was not okay. And I need to explain. I just stood there, arms crossed over my chest, a defense mechanism I hadn't even realized I was deploying. I was protecting my heart, bracing for the final blow. I was preparing for him to say it was a huge mistake, that he wasn't gay, that he was confused, that he hoped we could just forget it ever happened. I'm not sorry that I kissed you, Lucas, he said, and the words hit me with the force of a physical blow. My carefully constructed defenses crumbled. I'm sorry for how I did it, and I'm sorry that I ran away. I panicked. I stared at him, my mind struggling to catch up. You panicked? I finally managed to croak out. He nodded, his gaze earnest and unwavering. I've wanted to do that for a long time, he admitted, his voice dropping lower. Longer than you think. This was the point where my brain officially short-circuited. I couldn't have heard that right. What? I whispered. I've had a crush on you for months, he said, the words tumbling out now in a rush, as if a dam had broken. I'd see you in the lobby, always with your headphones on, looking so focused. Or on the rooftop, just sitting and reading. I wanted to talk to you. Like, really talk to you, but I had no idea how. I kept thinking, what would I even say? And I was pretty sure you were straight, and I just figured I was completely invisible to you. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. We had been living in the same building, 2 floors apart, both nursing secret crushes, both convinced the other was completely unattainable. And then the pipe burst, he continued, a self-deprecating smile touching his lips. And I saw my chance. He took a deep breath, like he was about to make a major confession. Okay, here's the thing. The pipe did burst. That was real. But I might have exaggerated how bad it was. The super had it under control in a few hours. He told me the building would put me up in a hotel for a few nights while they fixed the drywall and stuff. I told him not to worry about it. He looked at me, his eyes full of a sheepish, vulnerable hope. I turned down the hotel, Lucas. I came down here and played the whole homeless refugee card because it was the only excuse I could think of to spend time with you. I thought if I could just be around you, I could figure out. I don't know. If there was any kind of signal from you. If I was completely crazy. I just stared at him, speechless. The entire week, the foundation of this whole insane, wonderful, terrifying experience had been built on a half-truth. A lie of omission, born out of his own fear and hope. He hadn't just accepted my offer of a room. He had engineered the entire situation to get the offer in the first place. So when it was time to leave, he said, I lost my nerve. All week. I felt like we were getting closer, but I was still so terrified of reading it all wrong. And I just kind of short-circuited. The kiss was me finally doing the one thing I wanted to do all week, and running away was me being a coward because I was scared I'd just blown everything. A slow smile spread across my face. It started small, a twitch at the corner of my mouth, and then it grew until I was grinning like an idiot. The relief was so sudden and so absolute that it felt like I could float. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't confused. He was just as scared and hopeful as I was. You are unbelievable, I said, and the words